What's going on, y'all? KM Best here, your favorite 69th ranked Marvel Snapper in the world, here to talk about Marvel Snap's newest card, Black Knight. Now that we've had a few days to play with and against him, he seems like an interesting card, but ultimately one that is not worth the 6,000 tokens. Black Knight is a 1-cost, 2-power card that synergizes with discard cards. The way he works is that when he's on the board and you discard a card, you create a new card in your hand with that card's power. That new card is called the Ebony Blade. It looks like this, but one of the things that you'll notice is that, you see that 0, right? That 0 ends up turning green and then gaining whatever power the card you discarded had, right? So you do all that, you gain your power, and then that 0 again becomes incredibly crucial because Shadow King sends the Ebony Blade back to 0 no matter what. And that is one of the sort of major things that keeps this card down. It's a good card. There's nothing wrong with Black Knight, but there are too many things that hamper it to make it worthwhile. So as an example, let's say you do your discard stuff and you want to get the Ebony Blade, but your opponent killmongers your Black Knight before you can discard a card. You don't get the Ebony Blade. It's not like a permanent effect. You need the Black Knight on the board to get the Ebony Blade. And then you finally did get your Ebony Blade and you play it out there, and then it gets Shadow Kinged or Shang-Chi'd, because a lot of the time you're going to want to be playing this kind of thing when you can, like on turn 4. So you jam out your 16 power Ebony Blade, it immediately gets Shang-Chi'd and you cry. That's not to say the card is unplayable. I think I've actually seen more Black Knight than his general power warrants, and I don't think you can not succeed with this card. It's just that unless you're a fan of a couple specific deck types, you're most likely not going to want to spend 6,000 tokens or collector caches on them. These spotlight caches especially, like, there are certain kinds of decks that you will, if you are a fan of those decks, you will want to open these spotlight caches. If you're a discard sicko and you somehow still don't own MODOK, that's a great one to pick up here. But that would actually be the highlight of the caches. MODOK, I think, is a significantly better card than Black Knight. I have collected 5 Black Knight decks. Let's take a look. Let's start here. If you're a deck that wants to be playing big units, this is a solid strategy for you. This is a pretty basic Shuri-style Black Knight deck where you're hybridizing with Black Knight and you're hybridizing with Shuri. Really, all you're trying to do is make a very, very large Taskmaster. One of the things that I notice about these decks, though, is I feel like I would rather just be a Shuri deck. The Black Knight is not adding a lot to the deck that you didn't already have. In fact, I would argue it's kind of taking away from it because you're adding these sort of finicky cards in what is, generally speaking, a very consistent and easy to snap deck. Now you're adding all this awkward stuff in. I mean, don't get me wrong. I would also rather play an Ebony Blade that had 14 power on a Shuri than I would the Red Skull, because, you know, at least the Ebony Blade is not pumping my opponent's units, but I could accomplish that by playing Sauron instead, right? So when you look at what this deck is actually doing, it's not like there's anything wrong with it. It's just you took a very consistent deck and added some finicky stuff to it. Like, there's upside. You can get some surprising turn 6s off with Zabu plays, right? A Zabu into, like, a Ghost Rider with a Shang-Chi is super dope. A Zabu into like a Ghost Rider with an Ebony Blade if you pitch something big enough. Like, that is the exact kind of play I want to be able to make with this card. But Zabu has a major issue, and that issue is called Mobius M. Mobius, and that kind of just turns your deck off. And that's the issue I find that I have with a lot of the Black Knight stuff, which is there's a very common card that is played that beats all of it, right? And the way you want to avoid the tech cards like Shang-Chi and Shadow King beating you is to explode on turn 6. But the only way you can be a viable explode on turn 6 deck is to play Zabu and go like Ebony Blade and Ghost Rider, and then you just lose to the Mobius because the Zabu doesn't do anything and your whole plan on the final turn of the game doesn't work. So that's the main problem that I feel like these decks have yet to solve, which is they want to be an explode on turn 6 deck to avoid getting completely obliterated by Shang-Chi and Shadow King, but then they can't do that because of Mobius and Mobius. And unfortunately, like those decks, that play Shang-Chi and Shadow King, almost all of them are running Mobius M. Mobius. Here is a list that I got from my buddy W, who is someone whose opinion I really normally trust, and it's attempting to sort of hybridize that Ghost Rider Black Knight thing into a shell that's a little more sustainable. But just like the other issues that we have, right? Like instead of relying on things that die to Mobius, now we're just relying on things that die to Luke Cage. And it's sort of very awkward to play this deck when it doesn't go exactly how you want it to. If people were still not playing Shang-Chi, I would say this deck is legitimately good. But I think Shang-Chi has come back in force. We are back in a tech card dominated meta. And when I played this deck, I basically like lost 70 SP, like 20 ranks. It was not something that actually succeeded for me at the highest level of play. And a lot of the lessons I learned from Black Knight in terms of how it's finicky and tends to just go in stuff as a sort of backup plan, that might be the best mode for it, because when you build around it, you end up very vulnerable to a lot of very common cards. Here's another list in the vein of the tempo Black Knight stuff. And like, if you had to play a Black Knight deck that was not a Hela deck, I think this is the kind of stuff where I would start. It has the same issues as the other sort of tempo-y decks we talked about. But as far as just deck construction, I think this is probably my favorite one, where it's just like, okay, we're playing pure mid-range, no high evo gimmicks. We're not going to worry about that. And yes, if we get our Zabu rogued, or if we run into Mobius, we kind of don't do a lot. But like, we're going to ask a lot of questions, right? This deck asks questions very, very well. It's like, do you have a Shang-Chi? You better have a Shang-Chi or I'm going to beat you. Do you have a Shang-Chi? Do you have a Shang-Chi? It's the are we there yet of decks. And I do appreciate that about it. Like it is something I actually appreciate about it. So like if you wanted to play one of the mid-range shells, I think this kind of thing looks the best to me personally. It's a little bit because I am the Shang guy. Whenever I run into this, I'm playing Shang, so I don't really feel that bad about it. But I think generally into an open field, this would be something in the vein of what I was looking at, or perhaps hybridizing this with Hela a little bit, because the Hela decks do have the upside of, being Hela decks. Speaking of asking questions, this is the baseline Black Knight Hela deck, and I'm not actually entirely sure how to compare this to Hela Tribunal. My instinct is it's a little bit more resilient and a little bit less predictable, but most of that is because you're not an Invisible Woman MODOK deck, so you're not high rolling as high, right? This is the sort of hybridization that I talked about, where it's like, okay, what we're trying to do here is discard like 2 or 3 things, and then Hela's just going to be bigger than anything that our opponents are doing. And the strategy here is actually very straightforward. Because so many decks in the modern day of Marvel Snap are these mid-range decks that don't actually go that tall, the idea with Hela is basically like, I'm going to be a mid-range killer. If you're playing mid-range, I'm going over the top. And this build lets you do so without being wholly reliant on your combo the way that the Tribunal decks are. Is that enough? I think these decks are a little scarier than the Tribunal decks, personally, because the Tribunal decks tend to go a little bit, like, over tall, if that makes any sense. And I think there's probably some value in going just big enough, which these decks do, while also being able to play like a normal game of Marvel Snap. Like if you go Black Knight into Lady Sif something big, into Ebony Blade, into Dracula, into just Hela back, that's something big. That's kind of a shitload of points. Like, there's a real large amount of points that you can do with this deck, but it's not like an overpowering amount of points the way the Tribunal decks are. It's like an actual game of Marvel Snap level of points. And so that's the interesting bit to me, where it's like, okay, you are able to like actually just put a ton of power on the board, and then it's totally fine. I know people are going to be like, well, you're a Hela deck, why are you running America Chavez? And the reason we'd be wanting to run America Chavez in this list is because we want to get our early game about as much as we want to do anything else. We are not the kind of Hela deck that is only Hela-ing. Only Hela deck, you probably don't want to run America Chavez. If you're playing Magic Tribunal, I don't know. I'd have to do like actual math to figure that out if Chavez is actually good or bad there, because the magic really messes it up. But I would say that this list, specifically by being a little bit more mid-rangey, is able to, win some games that you otherwise wouldn't. It has a little bit more play in some specific matchups. And even though it is a little bit vulnerable to Shang-Chi, the Hela plan means that, like, even if you get shanged, you're gonna be putting a lot of power on the board if you get some good discards off. Blade is especially an MVP. A lot of your game plan does hinge on playing Blade and Lady Sif in order to get good big discards. Just that into Hela is very, very powerful right now, as long as you're doing pretty much anything else with your turn the rest of the time. So do keep that in mind, because you're also maybe pitching Black Cat pretty big as well. That's how it's gone against me. I find this deck actually very threatening. I play a lot of mid-range decks. It is definitely a mid-range killer. It does have the Hela issue of like, oh man, I just lose to myself. But as far as a Hela deck, I've never seen more Hela in High Infinite than post Black Knight. And if I were looking somewhere to make this card my own, that would be the kind of lists I was looking at. Finally, we got the Hela Lockjaw Black Knight, and the name of the game here is just cheat. All we're trying to do here is cheat stats, and Black Knight is a way that helps us cheat stats when we aren't like lockjawing here. We're literally just cheating stats as much as we possibly can, and that is the simplest way to explain it. If your deck falls apart, your deck falls apart. This is a pure casino deck. We run Lockjaw, we run Hela, we run Jubilee, casino galore. Like, there is almost no telling what happens in a game with this deck or a game against this deck. It is extremely weird and extremely strong. I have found it to be a unique opponent. I'm not sure which of the two Hela decks I'm more scared to see, but I've definitely seen both of them. It's not nothing. I think the first Hela deck would be my preference, but this one is definitely very scary to see and has a bit of a higher high roll because of the further investment in just high rolling Lockjaw. You can throw a White Tiger in there, get something awesome out. A bunch of cool stuff can happen with Black Knight there. Now, as far as him though, how key is Black Knight to basically any of the decks we just talked about? I think I would say probably only the Zabu Black Knight Ghost Rider decks are the ones that really need him, right? Like, they're Black Knight decks. And he makes the other decks better, but I don't know if he makes them truly tier 1 competitive. I think the jury is still out on that, but I would lean toward no. So, should you buy Black Knight? Should you open your spotlight caches for Black Knight? I would recommend against it. I think there are likely going to be better uses for those spotlight caches. And this is critical, he comes back around in December, right? So if he ends up being good, it'll be the kind of good where it takes a little bit of time for him to cook. And he comes back into those caches in December, so you can actually pick him up then alongside other potentially new cards. So that is an important thing that Black Knight has going for it in terms of not picking it up right now. In addition, 6,000 tokens is about half of the free-to-play player's token income. So in order for me to say this card is worth 6,000 tokens, it would need to be one of the two best cards you could get for 6,000 tokens. I do not believe there is a world where Black Knight is one of the two best cards you could get for 6,000 tokens. If you are a whale and you want to play decks like the ones that I have shown you, and you're interested in finding that out, go ahead, play Black Knight. If you are a streamer, go ahead, play Black Knight. But I think people watch these videos because they want my opinion on if the card is good or not, or more specifically, if the card is worth it or not. And I think at 3,000 tokens, it would be an interesting conversation. But at 6,000 tokens, I strongly suggest you do not spend tokens on Black Knight. All right, y'all. That's going to be it from me. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I wanted to do a little bit more than the previous videos where I was like, you shouldn't buy this. I wanted to show you what you could do with the card and then say you shouldn't buy this. But like, yeah, I didn't want to just do like a Negasonic style video where like my video title was like, Negasonic sucks, don't buy this crap. I didn't just want to do that. I wanted to show you where this card could be good because it's not Negasonic tier. It's like, it makes some decks better. It's just not a high priority purchase at the price point that it's at. That's really all that's happening here. So thanks so much for watching. As always, I have been KM Best. I will see you in the next one. You be good